Hi. Can you speak for me real quick? Just want to make sure.
Yes. Test. 1, 2, 3.
There we go.
Test.
Okay, we're good.
Okay, good.
Okay, so we're recording, so you guys can start whenever you're ready.
Oh, okay. So we can. Mrs. Strubert, or what is it, Strubhart sent me a list of questions that you had that you might be interested in me talking about. However, in kind of, I could possibly combine all these questions maybe into one little narrative for you. Unless anybody has any questions before we get started. I'd like to make it informal and get input from all of you if I could.
Really quickly, I could read this little paragraph just so it can go into like the database. Like each one requires you to read this, and then we can just start with like the narrative, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
My name is Charlie Kello. I'm a student at O'Fallon Township High School. We are interviewing Larry A. Freppon. He served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. Today's date is April 5th, 2018. We are conducting this interview at O'Fallon Township High School, Milburn campus in O'Fallon, Illinois. Also participating in this interview is Lauren, Allison, Lindsay, Nolan, Matthew, and Erica.
Okay. So now it's all official.
Yeah.
Yeah, any of those things that I passed out to you, just feel free to take a look at them and pass them around. The pictures that I have are all photographs that I took while I was there. I spent 3 years in Vietnam, and I carried a camera with me most of the time when it wasn't broke or whatever. So I took pictures from different cameras at different times and captured a lot of things in Vietnam. And I have stacks of them. However, I just picked up a handful of them. So feel free to look at them. And then I copied some in case you wanted copies. However, I think they're going to scan those pictures. Feel free to keep those. I also brought some stories with me that I wrote back years ago. It was a kind of a therapy thing back 30 years ago, and I'm going to go ahead and leave copies of those if anybody, or leave a copy of it if anybody wants it, so that they can pass it on to their friends or read it themselves later on. But anyway, I was born and raised on a farm just south of here, about 15 miles, in the little town of Hecker, Illinois. Born and raised there all of my life. I knew from a young age how to milk cows, how to feed the chickens and feed the pigs, and learned a work ethic that I think took me through the rest of my life. And that you got up every morning and the cows had to be milked before you went to school. You had to gather the eggs if you were going to sell them at the market so that you could buy a new baseball glove. Without selling the eggs, you didn't survive. Every fall we would butcher a couple pigs, and that's what got us through the winter. So I was typically a farm boy all of my life. Graduated from New Athens High School in 1964. Played baseball there and basketball. I played left guard on both of those teams. Left into the bench and I guarded a water bucket type thing. But was very active in high school, in the FFA, Future Farmers of America, in speech contests. I went to every speech contest there was, extemporaneous speaking contests, parliamentary procedure. Was very active in that. And in 1963 was the state parliamentary procedure chairman champion of the state of Illinois. So I was very involved in a lot of things at school, thinking that someday I would go off to college and become a millionaire and so forth. However, after high school, I went away to college for a year to Auburn University. And then my mother passed away, so I had to come back home to help Dad on the farm. And guess what? Dear friends and neighbors, we have selected you to serve in the military. So I was drafted into the Army at that time. Yes?
We're just coming to listen.
Okay. Have a seat if you make yourself comfortable if you want. Was drafted into the Army. and then re-enlisted and ultimately spent 8 years in the Army. Was sent away to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training. That was in the fall of '65. The difference between how I lived and military life was very similar. I mean, it was, I was used to getting up and every morning and working and going to bed at night after I worked all day. I was used to throwing hay bales and picking corn and handling cows. So the military was hand in hand with how I had lived, and I was born and raised to respect that when the flag was raised, you stood up, and when the Pledge of Allegiance was said, you put your hand over your heart. Somebody that was your elder was yes sir and no sir. So when I went into the military, I adapted to that very well. The physical part of it. The drill instructors back at that time in the mid-'60s were hardcore military drill instructors. Most of them, or a lot of them, had just come out of 20 years earlier, had come out of World War II, had come out of the Korean War. Some of them were even, and this was in '65, had even been to Vietnam already. So they were very hardcore. They pushed you to the limit, physically and mentally. They would degrade you, they would put you down, but it was only to see if you'd get back up. And if you didn't, they didn't want you. But if you stood your ground, if you stood up and said, yes, sir, and I learned at an early age also that you said yes, sir, and no, sir, and you listened and you did what you were told to do and you kept your mouth shut. And because of that, over a period of 8 years in the service, my rank went up fairly high. So it was because I listened to what they said, did what they told me to do. After Fort Leonard Wood, then I went to, they sent me back to Fort Leonard Wood, in fact, and I went through wheeled vehicle mechanics and learned to work on trucks and Jeeps and so forth. From there, went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and went through armor school and learned to drive and work on tanks, and that became the love of my life. However, when you get out of the service and you tell somebody you worked on a tank, there's not too many job opportunities out there to do that. But after Fort Knox, then they sent me down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and I was in an artillery unit down there. And at that time I re-enlisted because I realized that I wanted to make the Army a career, which I would have if I hadn't got shot. But anyway, so I re-enlisted, and lo and behold, I got the orders to go to Vietnam. And then I was sent to Vietnam, and we're going to get into that extensively because I think that's what it's all about, is about Vietnam. However, giving you a little bit of background, stepping back from that for a second, I had 7 brothers and sisters, because there's questions on there that I need to address you, who my siblings were and so forth. But I had 7 brothers and sisters. We were typically 10-member family living on a farm, all trying to survive. And my oldest sister, Billy, who lives in Belleville, her husband was in the Coast Guard. My next sister, Down, who passed away a few years ago, was married to a career Air Force officer, spent 30 years in the Air Force, and he still lives in Oklahoma City, where he's stationed at. Then my younger brother, I was the oldest brother, and then my younger brother spent 4 years in the Marine Corps and a year in Vietnam with me, and then spent 25 years in the Air National Guard. So he's retired from the Air National Guard now, along with 30 years on the railroad, so he's making a few more bucks than I am. And then my next sister down, Paula, she lives in Waterloo, and her husband was in the Army. Kind of see a pattern there of military. And then my next sister down lives in Valmeyer. Her husband was in the Army and was a chopper pilot in Vietnam. Then my next brother Doug, who lives in Rolla, was in the Army. And then my youngest brother, and the youngest of the 8 of us, who lives in Dupont, spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. And my dad was in the Marines during World War II. So, and then my brother Doug, who lives in Rolla, who was in the Army, his wife also spent, I think, 8 years in the Air Force. So everybody in our family were military oriented. And I think that's where we all kind of, as a family, became involved in yes sir, no sir, and you salute when the flag goes by, and you live in the greatest country that's on this earth. And even though you don't agree with some of your leaders, which as we was in Vietnam, sometimes you questioned the leadership of the president or the vice president or the congressman that were sending us to war. You had to respect their position. And you think about, what would I have done if I was in Johnson's position? I don't know if you've ever read or watched narratives of Johnson. This guy was in the middle of a chaotic time that I would never have imagined that he went through. However, you have to think about, what would I do if I was him? So all you can do is respect that position. That's what you have to do. You have to respect it. And if you don't agree with it, then say something later, but say, yes, sir, I'll do what you want me to do. But then is there any questions so far to this point? That's kind of my background. Basically, I was born and raised on a farm all my life, and then was drafted, and at this point, I'm in the military. If you have any questions or anything you want to say or whatever, just stop, and I'm kind of easy. That's why I taught school for a lot of years at the University of Nebraska, Teachers College, and that's how I taught my classes. You stop me anytime. If you got something to say, you just stop me and say it or ask the question. But then I received orders to go to Vietnam. And I was sent over in the fall of 1967. And it was, you knew about Vietnam, going through basic training, going through extensive jungle training and so forth, and survival. We were the highest trained soldiers in the world, very ready to do battle. However, then there was the impact of getting off that plane in the middle of a country that you'd never been in before. And I even think about it today, things that remind me of what I heard, what I saw, what I smelled when I stepped off that plane. And I flew from New Jersey over and landed in, I think, in Bien Hoa, which is right out of Saigon. Saigon is now called Ho Chi Minh City, but it's still Saigon to me. And from there, I stayed in a replacement center for, I think, about a day until a chopper came from down north and loaded me up and took me to the unit that I was going to. And what impacted me most was stepping off of this plane, and the heat was unbelievable. 110 degrees, the heat, the humidity, you could cut it with a knife. It was just, you just instantly broke into a sweat. And I think I probably lost 15 pounds by the end of the day, which I did ultimately. When I went over there, I came back, I had lost, the first year, I think I lost 45 pounds, and most guys do. You sweat it off, you work it off. Unless you worked in a mess hall somewhere and all you did was eat and sit in the air conditioning, but I was out in the field all the time, so I did a lot of sweating and a lot of exercises. The next thing that I really noticed was the smells of diesel fuel, because diesel was used everywhere. And you could smell the burning diesel fuel. You could smell the gunpowder, the dust in the air, the dirt. It was just dirty, just hanging in the air. So the smells, and then the sounds were of the hustle and bustle of Air Force, Army, Marines, Navy, all some marching to a place, or just the sounds of hustle and bustle of GIs, and the sound of helicopters, of choppers going over our landing. And even today, if I'm out in the backyard and I hear, it's just so distinct. You hear this pop, 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 and you hear that chopper coming over, and the first thing you look up at is it a gunship? Is it a Huey that's coming over? Because that was our lifeline. That was our bread and butter, were the Hueys, the gunships, which protected us. And then you see it's Channel 4 going over, or some Black Hawk coming out of Scott Air Force Base. However, the sound of choppers just kind of, and then the roar of trucks, and the trucks and engines and tanks that were constantly moving. So I'm out and I hear a truck go by, and I smell the diesel fuel, and it just brings back the memories that you had 50 years ago. But from there, I was sent on a chopper up to a little base camp called Dong Ha. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the country, if you've ever seen maps of Vietnam, but Vietnam was broke into corps. For the U.S. broke them into 4 different sections. There was the I Corps, and then there was 2 Corps, 3 and 4. So the country basically was cut in 4 sections. So if you went to I Corps, you went north. And north was nothing more than mountains, a lot of mountains, a lot of rivers, a lot of sand. The big trees were 10 foot tall, a lot of scrub brush, a lot of hedgerows. So the north was, and it got cold during monsoon season, which was a rainy season. So it got really, it would drop down to 50 degrees. And you would freeze to death. So that was the I Corps area, was up north, and that's where I was sent to. Then you have the 2 Corps area, which was the next section, which was basically the Central Highlands. And from there, that turned from sand into very fertile land. A lot of rice paddies, miles and miles and miles of rice paddies, and a lot of agriculture, a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables. So that was the Central Highlands. And it was a few mountains, but basically kind of flat, like going from Colorado into Illinois, going from the north into the Central Highlands. And then you had the 3 Corps area, which was a lot of fertile soil, a little bit more jungle-ish, a lot of jungles. And then you went into the 4 Corps area, which was the Mekong Delta. And that was to me, it would be like going from Illinois into the bayous of Louisiana. Nothing but jungle and quagmire and water and streams to cross, and it was just a big swamp area, and that went on for miles and miles and miles. Fortunately, I flew over it a couple times. I would never had to spend any time there because it was hot. It was snake infested and insect infested, and the monkeys and the whatever. So it was, the environment was very, very unfriendly. It was like living in the jungles. Is basically what it was. They talk about the jungles of Vietnam. Well, the jungles of Vietnam was the southern part of Vietnam. The northern part of Vietnam was sand and mountains and hills and streams. Most beautiful place you'd ever want to visit in your life. I mean, it was a very tropical country. As far as the enemies that we fought, you've heard about the NVA, which was North Vietnamese Army. They were primarily in the I Corps area and the 2 Corps area because they came out of North Vietnam supplied by China. So they had sophisticated weapons. They had a lot of RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. They had tanks. They had mechanized equipment like we did, and they came out of North Vietnam. So if you were in the I Corps area, you fought a regimented, organized army. They marched just like you did. They wore the uniforms just like you did. They had lieutenants and captains and colonels and generals. So they were very, very organized. Then as you got a little bit farther south, and the 2 Corps area had basically the same thing. You get in a 3 Corps area, now you still had some North Vietnamese, NVAs, but now you started getting the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were primarily in the southern part of the country, even though there were some who went up north. But the Viet Cong was nothing more than a militia of people. They were private citizens who armed themselves and went together, very little training. They didn't march in straight lines, and they didn't order, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. They simply were like a band of you getting together and say, let's take our knives and our primitive guns that we have, and let's all get together and let's overtake a neighborhood. And that's basically what the Viet Cong were. Very unorganized, but very, very tough to fight against. They were ruthless. They did atrocities that you wouldn't imagine, but it was only because of how they grew up. They were South Vietnamese who believed in the North Vietnamese and the communist cause. So they fought against the South Vietnamese people. So the Viet Cong were probably the hardest to fight against because you never knew who was. I could say, okay, oh, you're all Americans, and all of a sudden one of you here, and I don't know who you are, may be a communist, may be a terrorist, may want to blow something up. So you never knew who they were because they mingled with the people. They lived with the people. So it was very hard to fight those people. And then you talk about, well, we annihilated villages and we killed a lot of babies and we killed a lot of innocent people. Well, a lot of those innocent people were Viet Cong women, Viet Cong children being 13, 14 years old. So if they brandished a weapon and shot at you, you shot them back, and you figured whoever they was with were probably Viet Cong also. So it was a very hard time to fight against these people. But that's kind of a breakdown of the country. And anyway, I was sent to the north and sent to a little place called Dong Ha, which was a province capital. And most of our base camps that I'm going to be talking about were based or built by the U.S. close to small villages. So when I was in Dong Ha was a base camp for the Marines and the Army, but right next to us was a little village, like Scott Air Force Base, and Belleville's right next to it. Guess what? They wouldn't have put Scott Air Force Base out in the middle of nowhere, because how can you support people? So I was in Dong Ha. Other little towns around her was Quang Tri, which was a base camp. You had Cam Lo, and I'll be talking about these, Pleiku, but anyway, out of Dong Ha. Then from Dong Ha, I joined a Duster unit. Now, Dusters were M42s, military, you always have to tell them what they are. They're an M something, or they're whatever. Okay, they're noun nomenclature. You ever heard of noun nomenclature? Anyway, that's what it's called, but it was simply a Duster. It was a 47-ton tank chassis with two, and there's pictures that I think in some of these pictures it shows some Dusters there. But they had two 40-millimeter guns on them, and they would fire in unison. And they were very devastating. They were initially designed against, and if you found a copy there, go ahead and pass it around to everybody. Yeah, that's what I drove there. But it should be a tank with a couple barrels. I think there might be some guys sitting on the barrel of one of them. But anyway.
Is it this one, sir?
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, that's a duster. They were primarily made initially for air defense. They were air defense artillery, and they would fire against aircraft. However, we used them because they were such a powerful volume weapon. We used them for ground forces. So I joined that unit, and there was A, B, and C batteries, like companies or battalions you know as. These were batteries, and each one had 16 dusters in it. And when I came in, I became their recovery specialist. I drove a tank retriever. I was in battalion, so I supported these 3 companies of dusters. So wherever they would go, if they would go out on a mission, on a convoy, and if they threw a track, I'd pull them in. If they blew an engine, I'd pull them in. If they were hit with a mortar, with a rocket, if they were disabled, I would pull them in. So I was basically a wrecker service, only I drove an 88-ton tank retriever, and I would go out and pull them in. I was based in Dong Ha. I had a little shanty where a bunch of us lived in, and I had a cot, and I had my footlocker there with all of my clothes in it. However, I would probably spend maybe one day every 2 weeks in that bunker because I was on the road all the time. So I traveled between Dong Ha and Cantien, Rockpile, J.J. Carroll, and ultimately Khe Sanh. If anybody ever heard the name Khe Sanh? That was a big impact in my life, was Khe Sanh. So I would travel these roads, Highway 9 primarily, there's about a 50-mile stretch. And if dusters went on a convoy, if you sent a convoy of trucks out to go to a base camp to supply them with ammo, with food, with lumber, with water, with whatever you were taking to those base camps, and a line of trucks would head down the road, dusters would accompany them along with quad 50s, which were 450 caliber machine guns mounted on the back of a 2.5-ton truck. And it was devastating. You could simply plow up ground in 2 minutes by shooting these 50s. Imagine 450 caliber machine guns firing 1,000 rounds a minute on a 50 caliber is about that big when it comes out. And have 1,000 of those in a minute hit something, it annihilates them. So anyway, I was also with the quads. So they would accompany these convoys up these roads. And I might get to Cantien, and then I would be called on the radio that there was an engine had to be pulled out of a duster. So I would simply pull the grates, and in an hour I could pull an engine out, load it on a truck, they'd take it back to Dong Ha, rebuild it. They might say there's a duster with a track down, or if we went on search and destroys. Search and destroy, have you ever heard the term search and destroy? That was simply, we got the call that there was enemy over here. We need to go stop them. We need to find them and stop them. So our dusters would simply go on this search and destroy. We would go to this location, and we would try to stop the enemy, the North Vietnamese. And if more than 2 dusters accompanied a search and destroy, which was hand in hand with the Marines, the 3rd Marine Division, worked very close, knew a lot of buddies in the 3rd Marine Division. We would go together, and if more than 2 dusters went, I had to go with them. And then I would be with them in case one of them was disabled. I could get them out of line of fire instead of sitting there and being annihilated themselves. I carried a 50 caliber machine gun on top of my recovery tank. I had a gunner that usually accompanied me. A lot of times I'd go out on my own, and if we got in trouble, I would have to man the machine gun myself. But usually I had a machine gunner on top with me. So I became known up and down the road as the man that got him out of trouble. And I used to always tell these drivers, you break them and I'll pull them in. So I would simply travel the roads and pull the guys in. Anytime there's a search and destroy or a tank was hit, a duster was hit, I would be under fire myself. So I was under a lot of pressure, a lot of fire myself, a lot of times, and I was wounded 3 times myself doing this job. So, and that's what the Purple Heart is on my jacket. That jacket is simply a Purple Heart. That means that you were wounded in combat. Any questions to this point, or what kind of time are we looking at, or how far can I go?
I believe you can go as long as you want.
Okay,
So,
but you'll edit out all the all the bull, huh? But does anybody have any questions so far to this point before we go any further? Is it making sense at all?
Yeah.
Okay. And anyway, in 1967, the fall of 67, I was in my job and I was doing what I was supposed to do, and I was simply felt very good at supporting other people, and wouldn't have to fire that much myself. So because I was pulling people in. But then I got a call that there was a duster that was down in a base camp called Quezon. And I was called to drive to Quezon with a convoy and pick up this duster and pull it back to Dong Ha, which was about 30 or 40 miles away, bring it back the next day so that they could work on it and fix it. And little did I know that when I pulled into Quezon that afternoon, that I wouldn't be leaving for a long time. Has anybody ever heard of Tet in Vietnam? Tet. You all know what it is, right? Lunar New Year. Everybody in Vietnam goes crazy. It's like New Year's Eve here. Only it lasts for 3 days, and everybody gets drunk, and they all eat, and they all party, and they have parades, and it's just a big holiday that lasts 3 or 4 days called Tet. And this is in the first week in January that they hold this every year. It would be like you going to a New Year's Eve party on New Year's Eve, and you finally, 3 days later, go back to work. Or a week later you go back to school. So these people, this went on for generations. This happened in Vietnam. That was just their way. Well, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army decided and got together that they were, during this Tet celebration, were going to mount an offensive against major province capitals around the country, and that they were all going to hit in unison, and they were all, on the night of Tet, they were going to strike all of these base camps, all of these big cities, and they were going to win the war over this. So I pulled in that afternoon into Quezon, and that night Tet started, and the Tet offense started with the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. And some of the cities that maybe you've read about or you've seen, Da Nang, Pleiku, Chu Lai, and I can just go on and on and on, Saigon. All these major cities were hit at the same time. One of them you probably read about a lot was Hue, because Hue was a capital, the former capital of South Vietnam. And I had been through Hue before the Tet Offensive. And then I went through it again later because it was only about 100 miles south of me. Hue was the most beautiful city you'd ever seen in your life, literally. The granite and the marble and the statues and the pools, and going back to Roman times, how they built all this stuff. And it was a beautiful city. And when the offensive was over, it was a rubble. There was nothing left of this city. However, they also hit Quezon. Quezon was nothing more than the top of a mountain chopped off. You had a mountain, the military went in, they went in with big dozers, they went in with helicopters and dropped in bulldozers, and they shaved the top of this mountain off. And they built a runway, and then they built bunkers, and they built trenches. And we had to hold that hilltop, because if you stood on top of that hilltop, which was about a mile across, because it had a runway on it, you couldn't land jets on it, but you could land large cargo planes on it and so forth. You could stand at the edges and you could look and see the valleys and the mountains around you. So it was kind of a gateway to South Vietnam, and anybody moving in from North Vietnam, the Chinese or the NVA, you could see them. Now, see them not by naked eye, but with binoculars and so forth. So you could see miles away. You could stand and see the DMZ, the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. Well, why would they hit a small little base camp of 3,000 Marines and a few Army guys and wipe us out when they were attacking cities that had thousands of people in them? Well, because if they could knock off Khe Sanh, then they could knock off that gateway to protecting South Vietnam. So that was their objective, was that they were going to annihilate, they were going to stop and rid South Vietnam of Khe Sanh. So they hit Hue, they hit Da Nang, they hit Pleiku, they hit all of these big cities. And most of those battles lasted 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days. Hue took about a week until we finally crushed the enemy, finally set them back, and the Tet Offensive became a disaster for North Vietnam. We killed thousands and thousands and thousands of the NVA and the Viet Cong. So it became a disaster for them. However, they're now attacking Khe Sanh. And we're sitting on a mountain. They're surrounded us with thousands of people with their rockets, their RPGs, their machine guns, their whatever. And we were protected by wires, barbed wire around our perimeter, that nobody could get through the perimeter. However, they could drop rockets and mortars in on top of us. And by doing that, we couldn't get supplies. We had one plane, cargo plane, tried to land. In fact, I got pictures of it. I didn't bring them, but pictures of this plane crashing. And they hit it with mortar fire. It blew up, killed all the people on the plane, and it closed our runway. Then they blew up our runway. So we couldn't get planes in, which means we couldn't get food in, we couldn't get water in, we couldn't get ammo in, you couldn't get toilet paper in, you couldn't get the things that you needed in life, you couldn't get in. But that also meant that you couldn't get anybody out either. So if somebody was wounded, you couldn't get them out. Helicopters would try to fly in and drop into our base camp, but as they came over the mountains, they would be shot at, and the helicopters would be shot down and repelled. So Khe Sanh became known in history as the Siege of Khe Sanh. Lasted 77 days that I was in the middle of Khe Sanh, and nobody could get in, nobody could get out. Eventually, planes would fly above the range of the small arms fire, and they would drop parachutes down with pallets of supplies on them, with pallets of water, and they sent a lot of beer in because they couldn't bring water in, so there was a lot of beer up there. And you ever drank, well, don't drink beer anyway. A Coors beer at about 80 degrees doesn't taste too good, but believe it or not, we used it to wash our faces with. We used it to wash our hands with. That's basically what we used it, because if you drank it, it would just be sweated right out of you. But anyway, they would drop these pallets of food in, pallets of uniforms, because our uniforms were tattered, were torn. And then as they dropped outside the perimeter, we would send patrols outside of our perimeter and drag in what they could before they were shot at, and drag it in, so out of a pallet of food they might get a couple armloads of food back in to take care of 3,000 people that were trying to defend this base camp. They tried to try to break the siege. It was impossible to do for a long time. Finally, B-52 bombers started bombing around Khe Sanh. And what was a beautiful, beautiful tropical country of trees and sand and elephant grass. Ever seen elephant grass? 6-8 foot tall, just beautiful, like wheat waving in the wind. The bombs would come in, and what was a beautiful, lush surroundings simply became a pockmarked area. So they started driving the NVA back. They finally started breaking their back. And as they broke their back, then Highway 9, which came from Dong Ha, where I had just come from, that road had been totally shut off. I mean, the NVA had occupied that highway. So through bombings of the Air Force, they finally opened up our area so that a convoy, Operation Pegasus, which I'll never forget, was an operation where they sent Dusters and Quad 50s and Marine tanks and helicopters by the thousands up Highway 9, and they relieved us at Khe Sanh. They finally broke us through. It was only months later that they decided to disband and tear down Khe Sanh because it was no longer needed, because they had broken the back of the NBA and coming out of North Vietnam. So they decided that Khe Sanh was no longer needed. So then they went in and they blew up everything. They destroyed everything. They burned everything, and we moved out. And I have a picture at home of the last Duster, the last person to leave Khe Sanh before it was then growed up in weeds, and that's all it is now. 50 years later, one of our Dusters was the last one to leave Khe Sanh because we were the one that helped support and help defend it. Our Dusters and the Marines had their Ontos there, which were 106 recoilless guns. They had their M48 and their M60 tanks. We had quad. So there was a lot of defense around it, but that was the siege of Khe Sanh. And then from Khe Sanh, went back to Dong Ha, finished up my tour, was sent home, went back again in '68, joined the same unit again, did the same thing that I needed to do, that I did before. And then the third time I went back over, I was sent over to an artillery unit. At that point, I have a stepbrother who, because my mother died when I was in high school, or right out of high school, and my dad had remarried, so I had a stepbrother who was a chopper gunner on a chopper, and he was shot down in Vietnam and killed. So I escorted his body back in 1970, and that was the end of my Vietnam tour. That was the end of it. So I had ultimately spent 3 tours in Vietnam. Any questions at this point? Any comments? Anything? Is it making sense at all?
Yes, sir.
And then, and I have some stories well, anyway, from there I left Vietnam, came back to the States, just so I can finish up my little life story here, so that you know where I'm coming from. Came back to the States and became a drill instructor and an instructor at the same mechanics course that I had went through like 5 or 6 years ago, because I had risen in ranks. So I came back and I became an instructor at a mechanics course at Fort Leonard Wood, and that's where I finished out my career. Now, here's where it gets, people say, well, how did you react And what was your thoughts when you came back from Vietnam? How were you treated? What happened? Now I remember the first time I came back from Vietnam and I flew into Seattle, and we were laughed at. We were cussed. We were very, we were treated like dogs when we came back. Until you got back home. When you got back home, the first time I went over, I was single. Then I got engaged, and when I came back the second time, I got married, and the third time I was married when I went back over. And my wife supported me, my in-laws supported me. My brothers and sisters were kind of indifferent because they were at basically 18, 19, 20 years old, and they didn't know whether they believed in that war or not. So it was kind of, well, I don't know if my brother's a good guy or a bad guy. You know, maybe he's a baby killer, maybe he's, or maybe he's the greatest hero that ever walked on the earth. So I got mixed feelings from my brothers and sisters. But my very fortunate position was that when I came back, I was still in the military and went back to a unit on active duty. And after I came back from Vietnam, spent another 3 years on active duty in the Army before I got out. The problem with a lot of the guys, and I would say probably 70% of the guys that came back, and we're talking women too, that came back from Vietnam were either draftees or 3-year enlisted people. And when they came back from Vietnam, their enlistment was up. So when they landed in Seattle, it was, here's your discharge papers, see ya. And now they're stuck in civilian life, not having a clue of what's been going on in the world for the last year. I remember getting letters like from my wife or from my family that I remember when Glenn Campbell hit the big scene in the country. I never heard of Glenn Campbell before until I got back home, and then it's like, so a lot of these songs that were so for a year you were lost. You didn't even know what was going on in the base camp next to you. There was no communication, so you didn't know whether you were winning the war or losing the war. All you knew is that you stepped off that plane and you were a civilian, and it was your responsibility to get back home, to pick up your life, to do what you wanted to do in life. And a lot of them just flat couldn't. They were beat. They talk about PTSD today. And I look at some guys that they walk around and, well, the war made me do it. I'm a loser because the war made me do it. Well, maybe that's true, but a lot of them use it as an excuse that because they were probably losers if they hadn't went to Vietnam in the first place. However, there's also those that really had the problem, that did have the PTSD. My brother today is disabled because of that, being a Marine in Vietnam. So the guys that got out had no support. They were suddenly shoved back into civilian life. Their mom and dads hugged them and says, okay, John, go out and get a job. Or their girlfriend, okay, let's get married, and they lived happily ever after, and inside they're boiling, inside they're bursting, they don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, they don't know how to react to civilian life anymore. They'd just been in the Army for 2 years or 3 years. I was fortunate in that I got out, and I was sent back to a unit at Fort Leonard Wood, and walked in with other military guys who had been in World War II, Korean War, had been to Vietnam, and we kind of related, we bumped shoulders. We never talked about it, and that was a big problem, is that I never talked about it. I became very withdrawn. I didn't say anything about it. You don't talk about it. But being with other soldiers, other guys who had been through that, you could kind of understand where they were coming from, so you got through it. So I was a very fortunate one. So for 3 years then, I was a drill instructor and worked. And then when I got out, it was funny, I decided to go ahead and get out because I had been wounded pretty severely. I have a bum foot, so you see me limp, and I got part of a hip that's gone. But anyway, after 8 years, I decided, and my commander decided, that maybe I'd better get out, because I could never make any rank any higher unless I sat behind a job behind a desk the rest of my life. So I decided to get out. Had some friends lived in Nebraska. Went up there for the weekend to visit them up in Lincoln to say goodbye before I moved back to Illinois, and who knows what I was going to do. And fell in love with the city. Wound up going out and getting a job working for the electric company, which is like Ameren here, working as a mechanic. Moved my family up there. My son at that time, just a few years old. And then I wanted to go to college. We had a GI Bill. And those of you that, if you're going into the military, use the education. I have so many guys that I talk to, GI Bill, oh, that's a waste of time going back to school. But I'd been in the Army for 8 years. I was away from education. So I was kind of afraid to go back to school. You know, you forget the geometry, you forget the science things and whatever. So in Lincoln, they have not only the University of Nebraska up there, but they also have Southeast Community College, which is a community college like SWIC, except that SWIC would fit in their foyer. I mean, it's a big college, several thousands of students in about 15 different programs you could get into. So I enrolled in a community college. I thought, this is going to get me back into the education, back into learning again, learning experience. So I wound up after 2 years and got my Associate of Applied Science degree in welding, because I used that working for the city. And then I decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and keep going. So I went in, and with credits being earned from the previous degree, I wound up with a second associate degree in a year. So in 3 years, I had an associate degree. And then the college offered the top 2 graduates every year a Regents Scholarship. From 3,000 students who graduated every year, they would take the top 2 students. You were nominated for a Regents Scholarship, which give you 2 free years of college at the University of Nebraska. And I was selected and received that scholarship. So I went to the University of Nebraska, and in 2 years, got my teaching certificate. And then got a job and turned around and started teaching at University of Nebraska Teachers College Industrial Arts Department. And taught there for several years. And then I was offered a position back in Illinois with an engineering firm in St. Louis that manufactures wheel alignment equipment and tire balancers. Went to work for them and traveled all over the United States and all over the world, literally Africa and Germany and all over, training people on how to use their engine analyzers and their wheel alignment equipment. So I did that for a lot of years. My heart was still in pulling wrenches, working on a car. And you guys just love to work on cars or motor. Well, anyway, so I got a job as a service manager with Auto Tire in Fairview Heights, and I was their service manager for about 15 years. And then that was when I was 62. I retired because my wife had just passed away the year before that. So she's been dead now about 10 years. And my daughter says, Dad, you need to retire. You're working yourself to death. So I retired, took it easy. 3 years later, met my wife that I am married to now. Been married to her for 6 years. And she's a legal secretary for a law firm in Belleville. And she plans on retiring next spring. And we plan on traveling, which we've done for the last several years. We've been to Ireland, and we've been to Scotland, and we've been to Alaska and the Caribbean and Nova Scotia. So we travel a lot. So we're going to be doing a lot of traveling when she retires. So that kind of ended my my career. That's where I'm at today. I've been retired now for about 10 years. Live over on Hartman Lane in Shiloh, and have a nice little acreage over there. And that's all I do is work out in the yard all day. So. Any questions? We got time to read a story or two?
Yeah, we do.
Do we? Do we have time? Okay. One of the things that I guess I noticed more than anything in Vietnam was not only the casualties, the shooting, the maiming of soldiers, the atrocities that went on, but because of my traveling around the country, went through a lot of villages. And the thing, I guess, that struck me more than anything was how the war affected the little kids. Now, could you imagine yourself from the time you were 2 years old until you're 18 years old now, and your subdivision is in the middle of a war, and every day tanks go by, every day armored trucks go by, every other day North Vietnamese soldiers come into your backyard and search for American soldiers. American soldiers come into your backyard and they search for North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. And now you have a nice garden back here, and you've raised all these vegetables, and in a split second a bomb blows it up and it's gone. And every day you get up wondering, is Dad alive? No, my dad was killed. He was a soldier, and he was killed in the war. And maybe you're lucky that your mom's still alive, but maybe she's not. Maybe she's died. Maybe your brothers and sisters died in the war because of a bombing or shooting between two factors. And from the time you were this old, you remember that. Running around probably naked until you were 6 years old, because that's how they run around over there. And then they finally start putting on clothes, and because they didn't have anything to wear. And all of your clothes were tattered, and you live that way, and now you're 10 years old, and you still see all of this shooting and all this mayhem, and then you're 13 years old, and then you're 18 years old, and now you go into the military. But that's all you've known all of your life, is your neighborhood has been a war-torn neighborhood. Never anything to eat, never anything to play with, no toys, whatever. And I think that's what impacted me most while I was there, was watching these kids and how they lived in these conditions. And it's unbelievable how some of them were happy-go-lucky, some of them were missing parts, but these people lived that way because they had to. Oh, well, I don't like my neighborhood. I'm going to get on the bus and I'm going to go to Phoenix. I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to get away from this war. They couldn't. They lived in poverty. That's how they lived. So that's the thing, I guess, that impacted me more than anything while I was there. And I kept all of this Vietnam stuff in for years and years and years. And one day I was talking to a Vietnam veteran, and he was telling me about some of his problems, and I go, wow, I don't have as many problems as this guy's got. Man, I thought I had it tough. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to put a pencil to a piece of paper, and I'm going to start writing some stories, and not a story that's got periods and commas, but sort of a poem type of a format, not rhyming. So I started writing stories of my experiences, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. 15 minutes I'd jot something down. 2 weeks later, something had hit my mind, and I'd jot something down, and I'd jot something down. And a year later, I wound up with a book of 66 stories of experiences that I had in Vietnam. Never had it published, never going to have it published. Even though I had a couple publishers that had offered me, they were going to take it, and the preface was all made, and the cover was all made, it was ready to go, and I said, nope, just stop this. This is therapy for me. My grandkids have read it. My son and daughter, I have a son and daughter. My son lives in Belleville, just a few blocks from me. He's got 5 sons, and my daughter lives in O'Fallon, and she's got 2 daughters. They've read it, but it was more like therapy to me. So today I thought, rather than trying to express this in kind of an extemporaneous type of speaking, that maybe I would read some of these stories to you. And if I can get through them, I don't know. I want to try. So if I hesitate, you know that I'm swallowing hard, right? But the first one I want to, I better do this. Back a couple years ago, fortunately enough, I had cataract and glaucoma surgery, and I had worn glasses from the time I was 13 years old, and now I don't wear glasses anymore. But guess what? Now it's the reading glasses. Without the reading glasses, I can see nothing. Now you're a blur. Oh, yeah, you're all still there yet. So you see your teachers wearing their glasses like this. That's why they can still see you, but they can read what they're reading. So okay, good old reading glasses. But the first one is about Quezon. And I kind of penned this. Whether it's going to make sense to you or not, I don't know, but I'm going to read it. Time stood still. Infinity. Never ending. As we huddled together, the rockets continued to come. No place to go. No place to seek safety. Countless, the days continued. Day after day, night after night, the rockets kept coming. Withdrawing to myself seemed an appropriate haven. The will of survival was all that prevented my mind from shattering. Pain and the fear of death were ever so present. The agony of helplessness was on each face as I searched for just one that might help, console, and comfort me as I crouched in fear of another exploding rocket. So isolated from the world, not knowing and not being able to know the activities of our loved ones. Another dawn breaks. The rockets come again. The screams for help go unheard. Will a rocket find my bunker today? Will my life end today? Or will I, as so many others, suffer pain and agony of wounds? Yet we stand our ground. The enemy comes at us in unending waves. The NVA, thousands of NVA. My mind is nothing more than a shell. Thoughts of fear and survival are all that's left. Yet it continues. Several weeks now have passed. Hands are dried and bleeding. Backs are weak from digging and filling sandbags. Nostrils no longer smell, burned by gunpowder. My eyes are sunken and burn all the time. Dust and smoke are always in the air. Rats are everywhere. Sleep is disturbed as they scamper about, their snarling and hissing, sending chills up my spine. Each day, death seems more imminent. Today it will end. Tomorrow, the war will be over. Soon I will see my family. These thoughts are again whisked from my mind as exploding rockets envelop the lonely hilltop. Those loving thoughts are again replaced by thoughts of fear. At all costs, we are told, at all costs, hold the hilltop. A place called Quezon. An airstrip, bunkers and trenches, all surrounded by barbed wire. Living like a mole is a way of life. Sleeping in a bunker, sleeping in a trench. Breakfast is from a tin can. Lunch is from a tin can. Sea rations. Weight loss causes my jungle fatigues to become ill-fitting. Dirt is ground into the skin as unwashed clothes go day after day. Rips and tears go unmended. A clean shave today would feel so good if only there was enough water. My body is now tiring. My ears ring constantly from exploding enemy rockets and from our own guns being fired. Yet time stands still. Then the blinding flash as a rocket finds its mark. Sudden numbness, coldness sets in. My eyes are blurred by my own blood. My body won't move, but oh, I know I'm alive, but why can't I move? Then pain and fear of helplessness. I feel so alone, so isolated, it tears at me. Then blackness. My eyes open to the smell of medicine. Frantic movements to piece together another broken body. Now there are only scars and a memory. Today the siege of Khe Sanh is over. The war has ended. Many years have passed, but my mind has never forgotten, and I will never forget the 77 days when time stood still on a lonely hilltop of death, a place called Khe Sanh. That's what it was all about. Sorry about that. I wrote that 30 years ago, and first time I've probably read it in 20 years. But then I talked about how the young children affected me. And I wrote a couple, in fact, most of my book is about the kids of Vietnam. But I thought I'd read a couple of these here, if you don't mind. This is about, I was on a team that was going through a village, and we were looking for NVA, and we came across this little hooch. They call them hooches, little buildings that they lived in. They were little thatched huts, and they had their gardens behind them with their pigs and their whatever. And we came across this little hooch where this South Vietnamese lady was in, and it really impacted me. But hungry and penniless, her ivory soft cheeks showed months of famine. Eyes that were hopeless and longing for love. The young Vietnamese lady held a young baby to her breast. Both had seen very little food. Standing in the doorway of her thatched home, she held out her hand, begging for just a small piece of bread. Her husband had been killed in the war. The rice crop she had worked so hard for lay in ruin from a bomb attack. With no food, there was no milk for the baby. Oh my, what a proud, proper lady she was. Even as she stood starving, there was a proudness and alertness about her. A true victim of this war. As I handed her my rations, which I so desperately needed, an ever so faint smile began to show. With a silent nod, I acknowledged her thanks. As I turned around, the other men in my team followed my actions. Soon she had hidden away many days of food supply. Tonight, we would all be hungry. But tonight, a young lady and her infant would have food and a new strength to continue living. Tomorrow, I would eat again, but tomorrow a young lady and her baby would also eat. That's what the war was all about. But who were the real victims? It wasn't just our war. It was hers too. Okay. We still have time?
I think so.
Any questions? Anybody have any comments or any questions? I hate to just sit here and lecture whatever, but is there anything on that list that maybe I haven't answered?
I have a
Yes.
question.
Yes.
So when you came back from Vietnam, and how did you deal with the hostility from all the civilians here and everything?
I guess the easy answer would be to say that I became angry. but I didn't. That's what a lot of guys say. I became so angry I could just flatten those guys, those peacemongers and whatever. Blah, blah, blah. But you know what was really in our heart? We were hurt. Felt very trodden on. Felt like somebody stepped on us and put us out like a cigarette butt. We were nobodies. And it didn't make me angry. I just kind of looked at them. And I know in Seattle when I was ridiculed so bad, and you just kind of look at them and it's like, you just kind of bowed your head and you turned and you walked away. And you felt about that high, not inside, but you felt your morale was just dropped. And I think that's what happened to a lot of Vietnam veterans, was that they didn't become angry over being treated that way. They were hurt. And you, as well as me, know that when you're hurt, and you're hurt real bad, and somebody ridicules you, it takes a long time to get over that. And unless somebody makes fun of you, boy, you got weird looking hair. It was just a little thing that they said, but it hurts you. And it takes a long time to get over that. And that's what happened, I think, to the Vietnam veterans generation, is that we were hurt. We were just so morally defeated, and we went over there working ourselves to death to try to do something for the good, and then we were ridiculed because of it. That's a lot of veterans that I've noticed feel that way. So, and to bring back another question that was in there, I belong to a organization called the National Duster Quads Searchlight Association, because our unit had dusters, but we also had those quad 50s, and then we had searchlights. And I found out by accident years ago that there was an organization of about 600 of us strong, who served with the dusters and quads, who meet every year for a reunion. So I found out about 3 years ago. I was simply through the DAV magazine, because I'm a disabled veteran, and I found out that they had this reunion going on. So I went down to Nashville and met some guys that I literally had not seen in 50 years. And then last year went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. My wife and I went and spent a week. This year, in fact, first week in June, we're going to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and we're going to be spending a week in Gettysburg. So our Duster quad group gets together, and out of those 600 men, now only about 300 are still alive through attrition and so forth. They have 150 of us were killed in action. The highest decorated air defense artillery unit that ever served in Vietnam. With a Medal of Honor and several Silver Stars and gobs of Bronze Stars and Army Commendation medals. Over 1,100 Purple Hearts awarded to our group. So as we dwindle, we become closer and closer. So I belong to that group, and talking to these guys, they all kind of felt the same way. Here they were out there on that duster, and they were being shot at, and they were doing everything they could, yet they walked in to our country, greatest country on this earth, and they were ridiculed for what they did. And you just kind of bow your head, and you just kind of walk away. Okay? Good question.
Can you talk a little bit about Agent Orange and how it still affects you today?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one thing, as I'm thinking about this for the last few days, what I want to talk about. Agent Orange, as some of you may know, was a herbicide. It was a chemical that was designed to spray over the jungles of Vietnam to kill the jungle foliage, because the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese could get into this jungle area, and you didn't know where they were at. The planes couldn't see them, the helicopters couldn't see them, you didn't know where they were at. So what do? It's like you're hiding under a tree, somebody cuts the tree down. Guess what? There you stand. So they begin to spray this chemical over these jungles, and kill the foliage so that you could find the enemy. Well, little did they know that years later, and maybe they knew, but that's not for me to judge. I followed orders, but little did they know, I think, years later, that this Agent Orange would then become a physical impact to those who came in contact with it. I was heavily covered with Agent Orange many, many, many times. Now, the reason they call it, everybody knows why they call it Agent Orange. It simply was a chemical, but it was put in 55-gallon drums and stored in warehouses and on docks around the major base camps. And they simply painted an orange stripe around the barrel to identify that that's what it was. It wasn't water, it wasn't motor oil, it wasn't diesel fuel, it was Agent Orange. Then they would simply put this Agent Orange into, on helicopters or on planes, and they would spray it over the jungle. And this stuff would come down on you if you happened to be in that area, and it got on you, and it was kind of a oily kind of a substance, and you just kind of, you wiped it off and you kept going. Well, little did you know that later on it would cause birth defects. It would cause a lot of things. I'm a victim of Agent Orange. I am 100% disabled because of it. I've had cancer and I've kicked it, but I got through the cancer. I have diabetes, very bad, and I walk very slowly so that I don't stumble and fall. I have neuropathy in my legs. I also have a heart condition. That's why when I was asked to do this, I really kind of had to, is my heart going to put up with this? Am I going to be able to do this? But so I have to be very cautious about what I do all the time because of my heart. So, and I have a lot of friends who were exposed to Agent Orange. All of us had went through, most of us has went through prostate cancer surgery and have heart conditions and have diabetes. So it's affected a lot of us. And then you have people out there who say, well, he's 100% disabled, man, just because he fought in the war and he gets all this money every month. Well, walk in my shoes for a minute. I give up all the money in the world to be able to go out there and walk down your steps without hanging onto a rail, or stumble when I step off of a curb out in the parking lot. I got a cane out in the truck. I didn't bring it in. I didn't want to, okay, but I use a cane. So the physical, it was some bad stuff. And now I don't know if they've ever, I think they've gotten rid of it. They've banned it. However, at the time, they needed it. Well, we're going to test this stuff and we're going to see what it's going to do. So they put it into testing laboratories and they tested on rats and they tested on rabbits and whatever. And 3 years later, after thousands of guys have died because they haven't used it, then they finally say, yeah, it's okay to use, or no, we can't use it. I'm glad that they used it when they did. Yeah, I'm being affected by it physically. However, I agree 100% that it was used, and it should have been used because it saved so many lives. Yeah, it caused misery to me and a lot of guys, but it saved so many lives by killing that foliage and not allowing hidden enemy to shoot our guys. So that's Agent Orange. Thank you for the question. Anything else? Any other questions?
I was wondering, can you explain your many medals that you have?
I
Or
could.
Some of them?
Yes, I could try to. If you're aware of medals, that is a Silver Star, and I received that, and I don't talk about it because a couple men died who should have received it. I lived, so I got it. Bronze Star, and this is for valor. Bronze Star for valor in combat. Next one is Army Commendation Medal. That's also for valor in combat. So I've seen a lot of combat. Anyway, I got all these medals, but I never talk about them. Okay, they're medals to me. The Air Medal, that's for flying over 35 missions in a helicopter. and I worked as a gunner on a helicopter for a while. So I got the Air Medal, Purple Heart for being wounded in combat, Good Conduct Medal. Yeah, I spent 8 years, and man, I was never court-martialed. In fact, I don't think I was ever chewed out too much. I just did what they told me to do. Then that's the Vietnam Service Medal and the Vietnam Campaign Medal, which showed that I served in Vietnam. That's the National Defense Medal, which I think you automatically get when you come in because you serve in the military. These are, I belonged when I first got out of the service and moved to Nebraska. I joined the Army National Guard. So I got some medals. I was on one of their shooting teams and got some medals for that. However, after I'd been with them for about a year, they discovered that I was disabled. And he says, "You can't be disabled and belong to a reserve unit." Oh, I didn't know that. Well, yeah, we just happened after a year of coming to their meetings and doing whatever. So anyway, they said, you've got a decision. Either you can drop your disability and continue on with us, or you have to leave us and continue doing your disability. So disability, I didn't have to work. I didn't have to go to meetings. So anyway, so I left them. And then that is the Vietnamese Cross of Valor that I received from the Vietnamese government. Okay. So anyway, that's the medals that I have. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Time or not? I don't have my.
We still have, I think, an hour. Then when it's 10
Okay, we're
sharp. So,
Okay.
Yeah, we still have a lot of time.
Okay. Another story? Okay. This is about a young kid, young boy that I noticed as I was going through a convoy, going through a village, and I'll read that. Oops, yeah. So you're in ROTC, right? You're okay. And now, are you guys going to the military when you leave, or?
Yes, sir.
Are you? Oh, really? And what branch you going into?
I'm going Air Force, sir.
Are you going Air Force?
Yes, sir.
Air Force.
Air Force?
Air Force.
Air Force? Ah, yes. I have a grandson who's a senior at Belleville East who just joined the Navy. And he's leaving, he graduates next month, as most of you seniors do. And then in September he leaves to go to basic training in the Navy. So he's going to make the Navy a career. So that's great. Then my other grandson, oldest one, he graduated from East last year, and he plays baseball at Swick on a scholarship as a pitcher out at Swick. So, and he probably, if he doesn't get chosen by a four-year college in baseball, then he will probably go into the military. But he wants to go into what I was in. And I says, no. Go into the Navy or go into the Air Force. They got the schools. Yeah. So, and you guys know Grant Appel? Yeah, neat guy, yeah. He's going to the Air Force Academy, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Wow. I remember when his mom brought him home from the hospital. And here he is going into the Air Force Academy. A big smile with the radiance of an angel. That's the first thing I noticed about this young South Vietnamese boy. As he stood by an old truck that had been demolished by a mine, I wondered how this young lad could be so happy. As I gazed upon him, I suddenly realized, to my dismay, that he had only one leg. Yet he stood smiling and waving as our convoy passed. My heart instantly reached out to him. Here was a small boy, clothes tattered, with sweaty dirt streaking down his face, cheering us on to victory. Poverty and destruction from a war around him didn't seem to affect his happiness. Big brown eyes looked at me with excitement, his dark hair falling over his face, bronzed by the sun. What an inspiration of strength and love he projected that hot afternoon. How could a lonely boy, maimed by a war, show such happiness? Could one of my own children show that same happiness if they were in his place? A sudden glitter reflected from his neck. A delicate chain and a small cross hung from around his neck. The answer to his inner strength was there. I just knew deep in my heart that a loving God was giving him the joy he was showing. As our convoy moved on, he hobbled along beside my tank, his eyes fixed on mine. I knew that day he had seen my compassion, my concern, my love for him. Soon, his one little leg could carry him no further. He was left behind in a haze of dust, but I could still see his tiny white teeth smiling, with a small hand waving while the other one supported him on a crutch. I wasn't tired any longer. Somehow, he had given me a new strength. He had given me a new direction and a path for my life. I wanted to project that same love to people around me. I had so much, he had so little, yet he had a true happiness that only God could give. Then I had to ask myself, who were the real victims of the Vietnam War? That's what I seen in Vietnam. And then I'm going to have one more. And then I'm going to call that quits. Okay? This is about another little girl. In fact, whoever's got the pictures, there's a picture of her, and there's a guy that's kneeling beside her. Because all these stories that I write are all true, and they've all got pictures. No, it's a little girl with a hat on, and there's a GI that is knelt down beside her. Yes, that's it right there. That's the picture I took a few minutes before this. Okay? Innocence was a look on her little face that day. As I gazed into her eyes, there was a look of a little girl that somehow the war hadn't touched. Our convoy had stopped in preparation for the long travel into the mountains surrounding Quezon. A short time to relax, and then would we be off to meet whatever lay ahead. As a little girl came forward, a young soldier attempted to become friends. The little straw basket she carried would certainly contain a Coke or a pack of cigarettes that she was willing to trade for food. And that's how they lived their life. Smiles and greetings were exchanged. The beauty and innocence she showed brought back memories to many as they thought of their daughter back home. The laughter turned into sudden horror as a cover was removed from the basket. A hidden hand grenade exploded. The young soldier lost his life. The little dark-haired girl lost her life. A little innocent girl, so precious in God's eyes, became a victim of someone else's war, but not just someone else's war. It was her war too. Everybody get to see a picture of that? That was her. 5 minutes before she died. So I was very fortunate in some of the pictures that I was able to take. A lot of those pictures, some of them, and I have a lot of them at home that I do not and would not bring today. You don't need to see some of the stuff. However, the pictures that I take and that I show people I like them to be uplifting pictures. Villages, you can see how, has everybody got a chance to see all those pictures? Or if not, pass them around, take a look at them. But those pictures, and these pictures that are here on it, in fact, I think somebody was going to scan those. If they want to, they can scan those pictures. And those I just made copies of, and we can keep those here if you guys want them. So make copies of them, whatever you want to do. So, any other questions?
I have a question real fast.
Yes.
In class, we learned a lot about underground tunnels and the Viet Cong using underground tunnels. I was wondering if you had any like anecdotes or little stories about that you remember from Vietnam.
Yes, and they did make a lot of tunnels. The North Vietnamese and even the Viet Cong, they would dig tunnels, and a lot of those tunnels would go for miles and miles and miles. And if anybody ever watched the movie We Were Soldiers with, who was that, Mel Gibson, I believe, and it depicts some of those tunnels, and that was very true. That area that battle was fought at, I'd been there several times. But tunnels were a way of life for them. They would build tunnels. And I went into one tunnel one time on a dare, because we had what we called tunnel rats. We had guys who that was their living. That's what they did, and they would go into tunnels and they would seek out the enemy, and usually a small little tunnel would turn into a larger cavity. So these tunnel rats would go in, and to me, they were crazy. Oh man, to do what they did. However, on a dare, we had some tunnels, and this was out of Cantien, and there were some tunnels, and I was dared to go in and search one of these tunnels. And even though it wasn't my job, so you took all of your web gear off and your helmet off and your flak jacket off, and I took a loaded .45, which was out in front of me, and a flashlight, and started going in, but you didn't turn on the flashlight because you didn't want anybody to see you were coming in. But you had the flashlight there to turn it on. And as I got into this tunnel, and I probably got in probably 15 feet, 20 feet, which wasn't very far, and I met a rat. And that tunnel almost collapsed the side of the mountain because I made it much bigger. I mean, to tell you what, I came unglued, and I was a macho guy, but I tell you what, I never backed up so fast in all of my life. And when I hit the end of that tunnel, there were still jokes made about it that their grandmas didn't scream that loud, because I was absolutely petrified. But yeah, the tunnels were a bad thing. They were really bad. But we had to go in and search them. But I went in and oh man, I came back out. To think about it today, I'd never been so scared in all my life. And it was because a rat. I had met a rat, and it was a movement, and I heard her hissing. But in the dark, you didn't know what it was, and then you felt it on you, and you started backing up. So, but that's the tunnels. Yes, they were part of it. Any other questions? Any comments? Anything? Anything I haven't covered? Let's see, that questionnaire that we had. And let's see, I covered Agent Orange, okay, and I covered Quezon.
Question.
Yes.
So, since you were affected by Agent Orange, do you know if your children were affected at all?
To this point, no. No, my son and daughter, and that's a good question, but to this point, my son and daughter, my son is 40-some years old. My daughter, I think, just turned 40. They all have teenage kids. None of the kids are affected. My son and daughter are not affected by it, so which was very fortunate. And I don't know of any any of my fellow soldiers whose kids were affected by Agent Orange, but I would imagine that people don't talk about it if they were. You know, I might have maybe some closest friends who maybe their son or their daughter may be affected physically, but people don't talk about it. But no, I was not affected by it. No.
So, another thing I wanted to ask was about the booby traps. I didn't know if maybe you had any run-ins with any of those, or we learned a lot about that in class as well.
I did not. Our big concern was landmines, not booby traps, because booby traps were primarily found in the southern part of the country. That's where most of them were at, in the jungle area, because you could walk through the jungle and you're walking through the brush and whatever, and all of a sudden you step on punji sticks, you get slapped with and I've seen a lot of them, but was never affected by them. But that was primarily in the 4 Corps and the 3 Corps area. The Mekong Delta was where a lot of your booby traps are at. Up north was a lot of mines. A lot of landmines. So we had this road that went from Dong Ha into Khe Sanh and stopped through J.J. Carroll, about 4 different stops on the way. And this Highway 9 was a 1-lane, kind of blacktopped, kind of asphalt, crumbling gravel road made through the mountains. And if you had 2 tanks that would meet, you'd simply was off in the ditch, and then you went around each other. So it was hard to pass. It was a very narrow road, about this wide, and it rambled up through the mountains and crossed a couple bridges. And we would only travel it during the day. So when our convoy, we would get a call that a convoy was going out at 7 o'clock in the morning and headed for Con Thien. And the Marines would load up their infantry guys in the back of trucks, and they'd be our support, and then our Dusters and our Quad 50s, and we'd all line up, and we would head for Con Thien. During the night, the NVA would come and put landmines in the road. And they could take an area of a road and they could plant a landmine and cover it back up, and nobody knew about it until you drove over it. So every morning, the first convoy that went out, they had what they called a mine sweep. And a mine sweep was simply some Marines who had these big detectors, and they would walk the road, and there'd be 2 or 3 of them, and they would be back and forth, and they would detect mines in the road. And if they found one, then they would simply, and they were a half a mile ahead of us, and if they would find one, then we would simply put charges onto them and blow them up. And there was probably, I don't think, ever a day that a convoy left Dong Ha that they didn't blow up 2 or 3 landmines that where the road was mined all the time. And they'd walk all the way up. They'd walk all the way, and then they'd take breaks. Some guys would get on a truck and others would get out, and they'd walk for a mile, and we'd walk that whole length, and then the convoys would come through. And the road was clear for the day. And then at night, they started it all over again. So we would do that. So mines was the big thing for us. As far as any other types of trickery, booby traps, we didn't see that much up north, mainly down south. Okay? Any questions about the country, the topography, topography of it? Down south, and even in the Central Highlands, they had a lot of bananas, a lot of wild fruits, and bananas were all like this big, and you could eat them right off the tree, and they were tasted not quite like the bananas here at home, but they had wild bananas. They had crazy monkeys. and monkeys would actually attack you. You had to watch the monkeys. They were wild, and of course you were an enemy of them. And if you were picking their bananas and whatever, and they would throw stuff at you, and so you had to really watch for the monkeys. The snakes down south, some very venomous snakes. They had what they call a one-stepper, where if you got bit, you walked one step and you were dead, literally. Some very venomous snakes. Water buffalo up north, and even in the whole country, they had a lot of water buffalo that helped plow the fields. No tractors, no nothing. They were simply water buffalo, and they would hook their plows on the back of them. They would plow rice paddies. Everybody aware of what a rice paddy is? It's simply a plot of ground that they plant rice in, and then they flood it. And all of this flooding is done manually. They will have a rice paddy that's, say, 4 acres big, and they would plant the rice and would have a dike around it. And then they would have little paddle wheels. And they would take the water from this rice paddy where the rice is ready to harvest, and they would pump the water manually through wheels and whatever, and acres of water they would pump. That's all they had to do all day. Vietnamese kids out there pumping water. Anyway, they would flood this rice paddy, and then as soon as it was ready to harvest, they would pump the water, so they moved this water to different rice paddies. And of course, with the rain, most of them stayed very wet anyway because of the high content of rain that they had. But yeah, rice paddies. And then sometimes you got bogged down in those rice paddies because they were right up next to the road, and if you went off the road and you got into rice paddies, and they were unlimited in depth. I mean, they were just nothing but mud. They'd been mud for centuries. So rice paddies. A lot of American guys were killed in rice paddies because you got out in the middle of it and there was no protection from you, and you couldn't run. So if they had to cross a rice paddy and somebody started shooting at you, you were just kind of like a duck in a pond. You couldn't move. So that was rice paddies. And then the water buffalo, which, recalling an incident back, I think it was Thanksgiving of 1968, we was going to have Thanksgiving at our base camp, so we built a big grill, and we needed to meet. So this lieutenant of ours and another guy went out off the base, and they found this young water buffalo, and he became our steaks for Thanksgiving. However, there's repercussions to that, because you don't go out in Uncle Sam's farm and kill a steer, do you? So anyway, we killed this water buffalo and put him on a skid and brought him back to our base camp and hung him up, and I was one of the guys to help butcher him, and we had all these steaks and ribs and whatever, and we barbecued all this stuff. And then the old Vietnamese farmer had seen this lieutenant. They identified the Jeep, and our battalion commander then got a call, and this lieutenant came in and said, there's 2 things we can do with this. We can either court-martial you and we can send you to jail, or you can pay the farmer for the price of the buffalo. But that price is going to be about 10 times what it's really worth. And to them, the buffalo was worthless. I mean, it was you couldn't buy a water buffalo. That was their life. It'd be like going out and blowing up a farmer's tractor. You're dead in the water. So anyway, through donations throughout the whole company, we got enough money, and the lieutenant, when we went out and met with this farmer and paid him for this water buffalo, and so that this lieutenant wouldn't go to jail over it, because you just can't do that kind of stuff. But we ate for 3 days off of that water buffalo. I mean, it was probably one of the best Thanksgivings I'd ever had. And I remember that was Thanksgiving of 1968. I remember that. Oh man, we had steaks laying everywhere. We went to the Air Force base, which was in Dong Ha, and Air Force always had stuff. And you go in the Air Force, you got it when we didn't. However, there was stuff we had that you didn't want, or that you couldn't get. So we would bring in war trophies. We would bring in captured rifles. I brought home a couple Chi-Com hand grenades. I didn't bring them today because I didn't want to bring them on school property, but they're hand grenades that have been disarmed. They've been disarmed, but anyway, I got them off of a North Vietnamese officer, and then took them back to the base camp and disarmed them and sent them home and brought a rifle back. So anyway, we would take these, and the big thing was we'd get their rank. You're shot, somebody's going to get your rank off of you. So we would take the North Vietnamese officers, and we would, after we would find them dead, and we would pull their ranks, and that was the war trophies. So we would go to the Air Force, and we would trade them these war trophies for ketchup and brown sugar and salt and stuff that we couldn't get. So we come back to the base camp with this big case of ketchup and some brown sugar. We made our own barbecue sauce, and we made our own charcoal. You ever made charcoal? Yeah, take charcoal and burn some wood until it gets glowing black, and then so we had our charcoal, and man, we ate water buffalo for a few days. So that was a fun time. That was, and there were for some fun times, but then you have to think about the times that weren't. But I'm very positive. How did Vietnam affect my life? I think probably more positive than you would think. Once I realized and got over the being able to not talk about it. I know someone asked me one time, what was the thoughts in your mind the first time you were wounded? Which I caught shrapnel. I was in Quezon and I got hit, and I still got pieces of it in my forehead and here and there. But anyway, knocked flat on my back and woke up, and anyway, I lived through it. But how did you feel when you were wounded? Did you feel angry? Did you feel like going out and killing somebody? Did you feel like crawling in a hole? What did you feel like? First of all, very scared. Very, very scared that you don't know if you're going to live. You don't know if you're going to be able to walk again. You don't know if you're going to see again. You don't, it's all the I don't knows, and it scares you to death. I mean, you tremble. I think back now, I was just scared to death. And then, after it was over, I realized that I was not invincible. I went to Vietnam, as most guys did, highly trained, jungle warfare, survival. I knew tanks inside and out. And I was going to go to Vietnam, and I wasn't necessarily going to be a John Wayne and win the war, but I was going to be a soldier, and no one could touch me. I was invincible. Blow a bomb up under me, you ain't gonna hurt me. I'm superhero. And we all kind of lived that way, and you almost had to live that way. You couldn't be coward. You couldn't walk around like this, or somebody would die beside you because you weren't supporting them. So you had to be go, go, go all the time. But all of a sudden I found myself laying flat on my back, and I realized that I was not invincible. Wow! I didn't think anything could touch me. Nobody could outrun me. Nobody could outfight me. I was the best trained soldier in the world. And all of a sudden, now here I am, and I'm laying here, and I got blood running all over me. And the second time, when a machine bullet went through my hip, and I'm going, wow! I can be killed. And the first thing I did, I remember laying on the ground, and I looked over at this guy, and this guy reached down and he grabbed me by the hand, and he pulled me up, and he says, "Sarge, you can either lay there and whimper and die, or you can get up and pick your gun up, and let's repel and let's win." And that was a changing point in my whole life. Never forget that. And I got up and picked up my M16, and we started firing back. and we prevailed. Had I laid on my back and felt sorry for myself and go, woe me, I may have died from that. And that's how I've kind of projected my life, and that's how I've kind of read my life. You know, you can be the most popular girl in your class, and somebody starts a rumor, and you're flat on your back. You could be the greatest baseball player that O'Fallon's ever seen, and all of a sudden the ACL goes down, or a rotator cuff. Or you can be the best in speech, and man, you've got this all ready to go today, and you wind up with laryngitis, and down you go. And then you're going, oh man, poor old me. Oh man, everybody started this rumor, or I can't play baseball no more. You say, well, what else is there for me in life? And go a different direction and pick yourself up. And when you do that, reach out a hand. And that's what this guy did. He reached out a hand and he picked me up. If he hadn't picked me up, I wouldn't have got up on my own. I doubt whether I would have. But he picked me up. And that's how I've, from that point on, if I got knocked down, the finances went haywire, or you lost a job, or you wrecked the car, or the lawnmower quit, it wasn't, oh man, life again's got me. Man, I got hit in the back of the head again. It's, no, let's go on. Let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing it. Life is too precious. Life is too short. And when you get 72 years old, you're going to realize that, wow, I'm glad that I lived the positive life that I did while I could, because now I'm reaching that end where now I'm going to enjoy that life. I'm going to enjoy what I made out of my life. And so don't get knocked down like I did. And that's if I had it to do again, that's what I think turned my life around, was when the first time I got wounded and I was knocked down and I was down and out. I was not invincible. Man, that shocked me, really. And it shocked me into reality that you got to keep going. Any other questions? Anything? Yes?
I hope you haven't answered it already, but growing up, like during the Cold War and then actually being involved in it, how has that affected your modern day view of Russia? Well,
I understand that. First of all, let me talk about Vietnam real quick and how that affected my life. I, as a teenager, growing up and as a young kid, was taught that Russia's the bad guys. And Russia is the communist country that's going to overtake the world and blah, 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 blah. And you had the bomb shelters and the whole bit. And you're young, you're impressionable, and you believe this. Then as you get a little older and a little more mature, above and beyond 18 years old, you realize that there's countries all over this world, and they have the right to rule their countries the way they want to rule them. But it takes time to kind of figure that out. In Vietnam, when I came back from Vietnam, oh, do you hate the Vietnamese people? Do you hate the gooks, the blah, blah, blah? No, I can't say that unless he's a weirdo or on drugs or drink, he's a drunk or whatever. Do they hate the Vietnamese people for that war? No. We didn't hate the Vietnamese people. These people were victims of a war just like the Russian people are. They are victims of their leadership. Vietnamese people were victims of their president, of their leaders who led them into war. Didn't really lead them into war, they let them be sucked into war. They didn't lead them in, they were sucked into war. But I never hated the Vietnamese. Always looked at them as wow, they were a victim just like I was. But you know what? I went to Vietnam and I came back home. They was in Vietnam and they had to stay there. Wow, I had to give them credit for that. So most GIs really appreciate and love the Vietnamese people. And I think people who have been in that position now in our 60s and 70s and 80 years old, I think realize that Russia has the right to dictate and run their country the way they want to. We don't agree with it. Oh, it's a communist country, and oh, they're, but that's their way of life. That's how they choose. And who is it for us to say we're going to change them? Cuba, we're going to go to Cuba. We're going to change their lifestyle. They were born and raised that way. That's their lifestyle. That's what they know. That's what they have a right to live. If they don't like it, leave. It's like in the United States. You don't like our government? You don't like the way we run it? You don't like the way we vote? You don't like the president, whatever? Then guess what? There's planes that leave this country every day. Leave if you don't like it. And other countries the same way. I say leave them alone. Did I believe in the Vietnam War when I first went over there? Yes. Yep. Oh, we were going to be the saviors and we were going to stop communism. And after you're there a while, you realize that no. This is not going to happen. You're going to drop bombs. The only way you're going to win that war is to wipe every tree and every tunnel off the face of that country and kill everybody in it. It's the only way you're going to win that war. But all you have to leave is one man and one woman hidden somewhere, still alive, and in 30 years, they're going to be right back where they are right now. So you're never going to win that war. It was impossible to win it. However, here again, you had Johnson and you had Nixon, you had some people who were involved in this that were, to me, set in the middle of atrocities that they didn't know how to control. And then you had some warmongers. You had some people that wanted to be there. You had, which I highly respected, and I'm not going to bring anybody down, but we're talking about the politics. We had General Westmoreland, who pinned the medal on my chest personally. He was a four-star general, and so honored to meet this guy. And everybody in Vietnam just reverenced him. I mean, he was just, they bowed down to General Westmoreland, and he was nothing more than a warmonger. All he wanted was, I want more troops. The more troops I got, the bigger I'm going to look, because we're going to fight this war and we're going to win this war. And you had a lot of people that were leaders that were that way, that simply wanted the war because they wanted the war. They didn't want to win. They wanted the war is all they wanted. They wanted to be leaders of a war. Like the Air Force. Don't ever take the Air Force away. Don't ever collapse the Air Force because I want to be part of that Air Force. Well, don't stop the war because I want to be part of the war. And that's what you've seen in a lot of leaders. But they have their own right. Countries have their own right to lead and to live the way they want. And leave them alone. Stay away from them. Let them, if they need humanitarian assistance, in a second, yeah. Afghanistan and Iran, I believe in that totally because we were committed to it and we're doing that right. But in the end, we're going to come back and that country is going to go right back to the way it was before. Just like Vietnam. We left Vietnam and the last person flew off in 1973, and in 5 years, government was all established by communists. Everything was all changed, and they're living now just like they were before, only they're a whole lot happier because there's not a whole lot of guns going off in their backyard anymore. They're living happier. So leave them alone. They want to live that way, let them stay. Okay? Good question. Anything else?
Sorry, Julie.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, what message would you like to leave for future generations that'll view this interview anytime?
That war is bad. War is an atrocity. However, war, in most cases, is a necessity. If you want to live in a free country, you want to live in the United States with a free democracy, being able to vote, go to school where you want to, drive where you want to, this country has to be protected. It has to be, because there's too many unruly foes around us, being China, Russia, even New Mexico or Mexico or whatever, who want to take over our country. At all costs, we need to defend our country, our military. Without a military, you don't defend our country. Military is a top priority, and you say, wow, man, we need the Army and the Air Force. Man, you got military that's the biggest. Yeah, because without the military, you don't have a country. So, support the military. If you have a chance, go into the military. I respect the military. And that's going to give you a free country. It's just like you go hand in hand. To me, some of the priorities in your life. God is first. Then your country, and then your family. Without God, you don't have a country. Without God, you don't have a family. Without a country, you don't have a family. So you have to set your priorities, and to me, the country has to be defended, whatever it takes. And support your leaders. You may not believe in them politically, but they are your leaders. Respect them. Stand behind them. If you don't stand behind them, the country's going to fall. And it's going to. Just like Vietnam did. Yes?
He answered my question.
Oh, okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Anything else? Wow, that was a long time, wasn't it? But I enjoyed it. I hope I projected a positive.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I just, I remember, and that's going back years ago, I did my student teaching at the University of Nebraska with a senior class at Lincoln East Industrial Arts, and I loved it. And I thought, I'm going to teach the rest of my life. Well, then I taught for years, but I didn't do it the rest of my life, but I did it for years. So I enjoy this, but this is the first time I've done it first time I've talked about Vietnam in, like I said, in 50 years. So, but I appreciate your time. I am very honored, very humbled that I was asked here to do this. And I wish all of you the best. I don't wish any of you any luck. Because luck's not in the game. It's how hard you work, and it's how you let God direct your life. And if you let Him direct your life, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in here, but you will need no luck in life, because God will direct you, and He'll give you the strength and hard work, and yes sir, no sir, keep your mouth shut and listen. That's the direction to life, and that's how I applied my life. So I wish all of you the best, and I thank all of you very much. Okay? And I applaud you guys. I applaud you for taking your time to come here today. Okay.